Officer Ryan Steele sat in his patrol car, the low hum of the engine vibrating through the seat, his fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. The shift had been dull, just like every other night in this part of the city. No real action, no excitement, just the usual rounds in a neighborhood he'd long since written off as a lost cause. He sighed heavily, glancing out at the rows of dimly lit streets lined with decaying buildings and shuttered storefronts. He didn't want to be here. He never did. In his mind, this was the kind of place that bred trouble. Run-down, full of people who didn't seem to care about improving their lives, always blaming others for their problems. His breath hissed through his teeth as he glanced at the clock on his dashboard. Another 3 hours before his shift was over, and there was nothing to break the monotony. As he cruised past a closed corner store, a figure caught his eye. A black woman stood just outside the door, hunched over slightly, holding a plastic grocery bag in one hand and a cane in the other. She wore an oversized coat that swallowed her small frame and a wide-brimmed hat that cast her face in shadow. To Ryan, she looked out of place, too old to be out this late, too suspicious to be standing there for no apparent reason. He narrowed his eyes. What's she doing out here at this hour? Something about her unsettled him. Ryan had long ago developed a sense for trouble, or at least what he thought was trouble, and this woman fit the profile. Loitering, probably homeless, or worse, maybe involved in something illegal. It didn't matter that she looked frail. He knew from experience that appearances could be deceiving. He pulled the squad car to a stop across the street, his gaze fixed on her, watching her slow, deliberate movements. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, occasionally shifting her weight from one leg to the other. But that was enough in Ryan's mind. She didn't need to be doing something to warrant his suspicion. Her mere presence in the middle of the night in this neighborhood was reason enough. Ryan exhaled through his nose, tightening his grip on the steering wheel, his pulse quickening. Not from fear, but from the anticipation of asserting his authority. He liked these moments, the feeling of power that came with being able to command respect or at least force it out of people. And this woman, standing there as if she had all the time in the world, was about to be reminded of where she was and who was in charge. He put the car in park and swung the door open, the sound of his boots hitting the pavement punctuating the stillness of the night. As he crossed the street, he noticed the way the woman barely reacted to his approach. She wasn't nervous, wasn't fidgeting like most people did when they saw a cop walking toward them. It irritated him. "Hey," Ryan called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. The woman turned her head slowly, her eyes barely visible beneath the brim of her hat. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, and that only fueled his irritation further. He closed the distance between them in a few strides, coming to stand just a couple of feet in front of her. Up close, she looked even older than he had first thought. Her skin was wrinkled, her hands thin and bony, her clothes the kind of worn-out stuff that told him she didn't have much. "What are you doing here?" Ryan demanded, his voice sharp, authoritative. He expected an answer right away, but the woman simply blinked at him, her expression calm, almost serene. She didn't seem intimidated, and that set Ryan on edge. "I asked you a question," he said, stepping closer, his posture straightening as he tried to impose his presence on her. "You got ID?" The woman remained silent for a moment, her eyes studying him in a way that made him uncomfortable. Then finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer. I'm just on my way home." Ryan scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Home? It's after midnight. You shouldn't be out here loitering like this. What's in the bag?" The woman glanced down at the plastic bag she held loosely in her hand. "Just some groceries," she said evenly, lifting it slightly as if to show there was nothing suspicious inside. Ryan didn't care. Her calmness, her refusal to be rattled, was getting under his skin. He had dealt with all kinds of people in his career. Most of them knew better than to argue with a cop, especially in this part of town. But this woman, she wasn't playing by the rules. She wasn't scared, and that made him want to push harder. "Show me what's inside," he ordered, his voice dropping lower, more menacing now. The woman sighed, a tired expression crossing her face, but she didn't argue. She slowly lifted the bag, showing him a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and some canned goods. Nothing out of the ordinary. But Ryan wasn't satisfied. He had expected more. Drugs, stolen items, anything that would justify the suspicion bubbling in his chest. Finding nothing only made him more agitated. "That's all you're carrying?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. He glanced around the street, making sure no one else was watching, though he could feel the eyes of a few passers-by lingering in the shadows. The woman nodded, saying nothing further. Ryan could feel his control over the situation slipping away, and it infuriated him. He needed to assert dominance, to remind her, and himself, who was in charge. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, to escalate the situation. "Let me see your ID," he demanded again, more forcefully this time. The woman's expression didn't change. She slowly reached into her coat, her movements deliberate and cautious. She pulled out a worn wallet and handed him her ID without a word. Ryan snatched it from her hand, glancing at the name and address. Margaret Hill. A local address. Nothing suspicious, but that didn't matter to him. He could feel the control of the situation slipping, and it gnawed at his ego. He handed the ID back to her with a sharp flick of his wrist, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you out here, really?" he asked, leaning closer, his voice dropping into a near growl. "I don't buy your story. What's the real reason you're hanging around this neighborhood at this hour?" Margaret looked him straight in the eye, unflinching. "I told you the truth, officer. I'm just trying to get home. There's no need to treat me like a criminal." The calmness in her voice, the steady gaze. It was too much. Ryan's face flushed with anger. How dare she act as though she wasn't intimidated by him? How dare she challenge his authority, even with her polite words and soft tone? He wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed, not after this encounter. "Lady," he spat, stepping closer, so that they were almost chest to chest. "You don't tell me what I need to do. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I'm going to make sure you understand that." The tension in the air was thick now, the silence of the street amplifying the exchange between them. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. This woman, this old, fragile-looking woman, had somehow gotten under his skin, and he wasn't sure why. All he knew was that he needed to regain control, to assert his authority before this situation slipped entirely out of his hands, and he wasn't going to stop until he did. The air felt heavier as Officer Ryan Steele stood towering over Margaret, his chest rising and falling in shallow, frustrated breaths. He couldn't understand it. How this elderly woman, so small and seemingly frail, could remain so composed in the face of his authority. He was used to people quaking at the sight of his uniform, especially in this neighborhood. But she wasn't like the others, and that unnerved him. The street around them remained eerily quiet, the occasional distant sound of a car engine or a muffled conversation drifting through the air. A few pedestrians had passed by, quickening their pace when they saw the confrontation, afraid to be caught in the middle of whatever was about to unfold. The yellow light from the street lamps cast long, warped shadows over the cracked pavement, giving the scene an unsettling feeling, as though it were taking place in some distorted dream. Ryan was seething. Every second that Margaret stood there calm and steady was another blow to his ego. He could feel his patience wearing thin, his control slipping through his fingers like water. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers itching to make some kind of move, something that would force her to react the way he expected. Fearful, obedient, submissive. But she just stood there, her cane held loosely in one hand, her eyes locked onto his with an expression he couldn't read. It wasn't defiance exactly, but it wasn't fear either. It was confidence. And that's what made it worse. She was confident, even in the face of his authority, and that was a problem. "You're not from around here, are you?" Ryan spat, taking another step closer, his face inches from hers now, his breath hot, laced with the coffee he'd been drinking all night to keep himself awake. Margaret didn't flinch. I've lived in this neighborhood longer than you've been an officer, she replied evenly, her voice soft yet firm. I know these streets better than most. Ryan gritted his teeth. That wasn't the answer he wanted. He wanted her to falter, to show some sign that she was scared of him, that she recognized his power. But she didn't. She spoke as though she had nothing to fear, as though she were the one in control, and that was unacceptable. Then you should know better than to stand out here in the middle of the night, he growled. You know what happens around here, don't you? It's not safe, not for someone like you. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. I've seen worse things than you could imagine, officer. Standing outside a closed store isn't one of them. Her words stung, though Ryan didn't fully understand why. Maybe it was the way she said them, so calm and collected, as though she had nothing to prove. It only made his blood boil more. He took another step forward, so close now that their shoes nearly touched. He could see the fine lines in her face, the silver strands of hair escaping from beneath her wide-brimmed hat. She looked tired, but not vulnerable, and that made him furious. Let me tell you something, lady, he said, his voice low, filled with barely restrained anger. You don't get to talk to me like that. You don't get to stand here and act like you're above the rules. You don't get to disrespect me. Margaret tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing together in a thoughtful line. She looked at him, really looked at him, as though she were trying to figure him out, to peel back the layers of his anger and find something deeper. Her silence made Ryan even more uncomfortable, as though she could see right through him, past the uniform, past the badge, into something he didn't want to acknowledge. I'm not disrespecting you, officer, she said quietly after a long pause. I'm just not afraid of you. That did it. Ryan's vision blurred with rage, his jaw clenching so hard that it hurt. How dare she? How dare this old woman stand there and say that to him, a police officer? It wasn't just an insult to him, it was an insult to everything he represented, everything he stood for. He had the authority, not her. She was supposed to fear him. She was supposed to respect him. That was how things worked. You should be, he hissed, his voice barely more than a whisper now. His hand twitched near his belt where his flashlight hung. A silent threat. You don't know who you're messing with. Margaret's eyes flicked down briefly, noticing the movement of his hand, but she didn't back away. She didn't even blink. You don't know who you're talking to, Officer Steele, she said softly. Ryan's stomach twisted. Something about the way she said his name, his full name, sent a jolt of unease through him. How did she know his name? He hadn't introduced himself. The realization hit him like a slap in the face, but he quickly shoved it aside. She could have seen his name tag, he reasoned. That was all. There was no way she knew anything about him. But that brief moment of doubt, that small seed of fear, planted itself in the back of his mind, gnawing at him as he stood there trying to maintain his composure. He couldn't let her see it. He couldn't let her win. You think you're smart, don't you? He spat, the venom in his words barely concealed. You think you can just stand here and talk to me like that, like you're better than me? I never said that, Margaret replied, her voice still calm, still infuriatingly steady. I'm just trying to get home. Ryan snapped, stepping even closer until there was almost no space between them. You're lying. I know you are. I can see it in your eyes. Margaret's gaze didn't falter. And what do you see in my eyes, officer? Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in the encounter, he found himself at a loss. What did he see in her eyes? He didn't know. All he knew was that she wasn't reacting the way she should be. She wasn't scared, and that was throwing him off. It made him feel small, powerless, as though his badge, his uniform, meant nothing in this moment. And that was the most dangerous feeling of all. Listen, he said, his voice trembling slightly now, betraying the anger simmering just beneath the surface. You don't get to walk away from this. Not after disrespecting me like that. You're going to learn your place, and I'm going to make sure you do." Margaret remained silent, her eyes locked on his, watching him carefully. She wasn't challenging him, at least not overtly, but her calmness, her refusal to bow to his authority, was a challenge in itself, and Ryan didn't know how to handle it. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "Why are you acting like you're untouchable? You're not. I can arrest you right now and no one would care." "You could," Margaret replied quietly. "But would that make you feel better, Officer Steele?" The question took him by surprise, his fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white as he tried to suppress the urge to lash out. How could she remain so calm? How could she stand there in the face of his growing rage and still ask him that question? Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse racing as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. He wanted to do something, anything that would break her composure, that would make her react the way he expected her to. But nothing he said, nothing he did, seemed to get through to her, and that terrified him more than he cared to admit. "You're not walking away from this," he said again, his voice shaking. "I'm going to make sure of that." But even as he said the words, he felt their hollowness. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what would happen next. For the first time, he didn't know if he had control over the situation. Margaret's silence, her unwavering calmness, had thrown him completely off balance, and he didn't know how to regain control. The tension between them hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The street around them remained quiet, but the weight of their confrontation pressed down on Ryan's chest like a heavy stone. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his body preparing for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Margaret remained still, her eyes locked onto his, her expression unreadable, and in that moment Ryan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. For the first time, he questioned himself. He questioned his motives, his actions, his role in this moment. And that doubt was more terrifying than anything else. Ryan Steele's breath was coming in ragged, shallow bursts now, the air between him and Margaret Hill feeling thick with unspoken tension. His mind raced, churning with conflicting impulses. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to anyone standing up to him, especially not someone like her, someone who should be easy to break, easy to control. In an instant, something snapped inside him. He couldn't take it anymore. This feeling of being so powerless, of being stared down by a woman who was half his size and more than twice his age. He had to show her, had to make her understand that there was no escaping his authority, that there was no way she could win this game of silent defiance. Without thinking, his hand shot out, grabbing Margaret's thin arm, yanking her forward with more force than was necessary. Her body jerked toward him, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of pain cross her face, though she made no sound. The groceries in her hand shook, but she didn't drop them. Her cane wobbled and she shifted her weight to keep from falling, her balance momentarily disrupted. "You think you can just stand here and talk to me like that?" Ryan hissed, his face close to hers, his voice low and venomous. His grip on her arm tightened, his fingers digging into her skin. "You think I'm going to let you walk away after disrespecting me?" Margaret didn't say a word. Her eyes flicked down to where his hand gripped her arm, then back up to meet his gaze, calm and steady as ever. That look, how she refused to cower or react, fueled his rage further. He expected her to cry out, to apologize, to plead for him to let go. But she did none of those things. "Let go of me," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. Ryan's grip tightened further. He could feel her frail bones under his fingers, and something in the back of his mind told him to stop, to pull back before things got worse. But that part of him was quickly drowned out by the roar of his frustration. How could she still be so calm? "No," he spat, pulling her even closer. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You're the one who's out here acting like you own the place." "Well, guess what? You don't." "I do." Margaret blinked, her eyes still holding that unnerving calm. "Is this really about me, Officer Steele? Or is this about you?" Her words cut through him sharper than any physical blow. He felt a jolt of anger surge through his veins, his heart pounding in his ears. How dare she speak to him like that? How dare she try to psychoanalyze him, as if she knew anything about him or what he was going through? "Shut up," he growled, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You don't know anything about me." Her silence in response was deafening. It was as if she didn't need to say anything further, as if her gaze alone was enough to call out the weakness she saw in him, the uncertainty simmering beneath the surface of his anger. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of his badge, his power, or his threats, and that terrified him. "I'm not going to ask you again," he said, his voice louder now, cracking slightly with the weight of his own uncertainty. "You either cooperate, or this is going to get a lot worse for you." Still, Margaret didn't move. She didn't pull away, didn't struggle, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she looked at him with those same calm, unblinking eyes and said, "You already lost control the moment you laid a hand on me, Officer Steele." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, trying to process what she had said, but before he could fully register it, his body reacted. His free hand came up, and before he could stop himself, he threw a punch. It happened in a flash, a quick, sharp movement, his fist connecting with the side of her face. The impact was harder than he intended, and the force of it sent Margaret stumbling backward. Her cane clattered to the ground, her body twisting awkwardly as she tried to steady herself. Her grocery bag spilled open, cans rolling across the pavement, a loaf of bread landing in the gutter. Ryan stood there frozen for a moment, his fist still clenched, his breath coming in harsh, uneven gasps. The sound of the punch seemed to echo in the stillness of the street, reverberating through his head. His heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears as the reality of what he had just done settled over him like a cold blanket. Margaret fell to one knee, her hand bracing against the ground as she slowly regained her balance. She didn't cry out, didn't scream or shout. She simply wiped a small trickle of blood from the corner of her mouth with the back of her hand and stood up, shakily but determined. For a moment, Ryan felt a surge of satisfaction, a sick sense of relief that he had finally broken her, that he had finally made her understand who was in charge. But that feeling vanished almost as quickly as it came when Margaret turned to face him again. Her gaze was still calm, still steady, but now there was something else in her eyes, something that made Ryan's stomach twist with a cold, creeping sense of dread. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was disappointment. "You're going to regret that," she said quietly, her voice soft, but carrying an undeniable weight. Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the way she said those words with such certainty unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. He opened his mouth to respond, to say something, to regain control of the situation, but nothing came out. His throat felt tight, his tongue heavy. Suddenly, Margaret reached into her coat pocket. The movement was slow and deliberate, and Ryan's instincts kicked in. His hand went to his gun, his fingers curling around the handle as he watched her every move. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought she might be pulling out a weapon, something she had concealed all along, waiting for the right moment to strike back. But it wasn't a weapon she pulled from her pocket. It was something much worse. Margaret slowly held out a small black leather wallet and flipped it open with a practiced motion. Inside was a gleaming FBI badge, the gold and silver reflecting the dim light of the street lamp overhead. Ryan's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the badge in disbelief. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He tried to form words, to say something, anything, but his voice failed him. "I'm Special Agent Margaret Hill," she said softly, her voice carrying a tone of quiet authority that was far more intimidating than any shout or threat. "Undercover, and you, Officer Steele, just made a very, very big mistake." Ryan felt the world tilt around him, a nauseating wave of panic flooding his system. His hand dropped from his gun, hanging limp at his side as he stared at the badge, at the woman he had just assaulted, an FBI agent undercover. The reality of what he had done crashed down on him like a tidal wave, his mind racing, scrambling for a way out, for some explanation or excuse that could undo the damage. But there was none. There was no way to take back the punch, no way to erase the fact that he had just assaulted a federal agent in broad view of the street. His entire career, everything he had worked for, was unraveling before his eyes. Margaret took a step toward him, her eyes never leaving his. "Backup is on the way," she said calmly, her tone almost sympathetic. "You're going to answer for what you've done, Officer Steele." Ryan's stomach twisted into knots, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him. His mind screamed at him to run, to get away before it was too late, but his body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the weight of his own actions. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. Margaret's calm voice cut through the fog of his thoughts, a final damning sentence. "You're finished." In the distance, Ryan could hear the faint sound of sirens approaching, growing louder with each passing second. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling as he stared at the woman in front of him. Not an elderly stranger, but an FBI agent who held his fate in her hands. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ryan Steele stood frozen, staring at the FBI badge in Margaret Hill's hand as if it were a snake poised to strike. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to reconcile the frail old woman he had struck with the hardened federal agent now standing before him. He felt a strange buzzing in his ears, a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach as the reality of his actions settled over him like a suffocating weight. He had punched an undercover FBI agent. The sirens in the distance were growing louder, but Ryan could barely hear them. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, drowning out the sounds of the city around him. His hand hovered near his belt, unsure of what to do. Should he grab his radio? Call for help? No, that was useless. Help was already coming, but it wasn't for him. He wasn't the one being rescued tonight. Margaret stood quietly, her posture relaxed yet authoritative. The slight bruise from his punch was still visible on her face, but now her expression was unreadable. She had already moved past the physical pain. Ryan could see that. What remained was something far more unsettling. She wasn't angry, wasn't yelling or threatening. She was simply waiting, as if she knew what would happen next, as if she were merely watching the inevitable unfold. "You don't understand," Ryan muttered, his voice hoarse and shaky. "You don't. This wasn't supposed to happen." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She stood still, the weight of her gaze pressing down on him like an invisible force. Finally she spoke, her voice as calm and measured as ever. "You've made it happen, Officer Steele. You made choices." Ryan's jaw clenched. The street felt unbearably quiet, save for the approaching sirens, the familiar sounds that had always reassured him. The wail of police cars, the sight of flashing lights. Now they filled him with dread. His knees felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. "I didn't," Ryan started, his voice cracking as he tried to explain himself. "I didn't know who you were. You're undercover, I'm an FBI agent and you assaulted me," Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuses with cold precision. "That's all that matters now." Ryan stared at her, his face contorted in a mix of confusion and anger. He didn't know how to react. Everything about this moment felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. How had he gotten here? He was the cop. He was supposed to be the one in control. This was his beat, his street, his rules. Yet somehow, everything had flipped in an instant. Margaret took a step forward, her eyes still locked onto his. "You think you're above the law, don't you?" she said softly, almost in a whisper. "You've been doing this for a long time, haven't you? Picking on the people you think can't fight back." Ryan felt his throat tighten. He wanted to shout, to push back against her words, but the weight of what she was saying was crushing him. She knew. She could see through him. She knew exactly who he was and what he had been doing. "I was just," Ryan began, but he didn't know how to finish the sentence. Just what? Just enforcing the law? Just doing his job? The excuses felt hollow, even to him. His mind reeled, grasping for something, anything, that would make this situation salvageable. Margaret's voice cut through his thoughts again. "I've been watching your department for a while," she said, her tone calm but with an edge of authority that Ryan could not ignore. "You're not the only one. This corruption, this abuse of power, it runs deep, and you were part of it." Ryan's eyes widened. His heart skipped a beat. He had always known there was a level of investigation into his precinct. There had been whispers of a federal probe, of outsiders snooping around, but no one ever thought it would come to this. No one thought an undercover operation would target someone like him. He wasn't a criminal, at least not in his mind. He was just a cop doing his job. "I didn't," Ryan started again, but Margaret didn't let him finish. "You didn't mean to get caught," she said bluntly. "You didn't think anyone would ever hold you accountable. But you were wrong. Very wrong." The weight of her words sank into Ryan like stones, pulling him down into a pit of dread and panic. He wanted to fight back, to argue, but what could he say? He had punched her. He had crossed a line in a way that couldn't be undone, and now here she was, holding all the power in the palm of her hand. Margaret took another step forward, her face now just inches from his. Ryan could see the bruising on her cheek, the slight swelling where his fist had connected. Guilt gnawed at him, though he tried to push it down. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered again, his voice weak and trembling. "But it did," Margaret said, her tone devoid of sympathy. "And now you're going to face the consequences." The sirens were deafening now, and Ryan turned his head slightly to see the flashing lights coming around the corner. A black SUV and 2 squad cars pulled up, tires screeching as they came to an abrupt stop. Doors opened and several men in suits emerged from the SUV, followed by uniformed officers from the squad cars. Ryan's breath hitched in his throat as he recognized the FBI agents stepping out, their expressions stern and businesslike. Margaret didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her badge still in hand, waiting for the others to arrive. Ryan felt his stomach drop as one of the agents, a tall man with a stern face and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached Margaret. He gave her a brief nod of respect. "Agent Hill," the man said, his tone respectful but urgent. "Are you all right?" Margaret nodded once. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "I've got everything I need. He gave me more than enough evidence." Ryan's mind reeled. More than enough evidence? What did she mean? His eyes darted back to Margaret, and for the first time he noticed something small, barely visible, tucked into the collar of her coat. A tiny camera, no bigger than a button, was embedded in the fabric. His breath caught in his throat. They had been recording the entire time. His assault, his threats, everything had been captured on video. He could feel the ground slipping out from beneath him. His career, his life, everything was falling apart piece by piece. You set me up," Ryan whispered, the realization hitting him like a freight train. Margaret didn't respond at first. She simply stared at him with that same calm, unblinking gaze that had unnerved him from the start. Finally she spoke, her voice steady and cold. "I didn't need to set you up, Officer Steele. You set yourself up the moment you decided to abuse your authority. All I did was give you the opportunity to show your true colors." Ryan felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead, his pulse pounding in his temples, and his hands shaking uncontrollably. He had always thought he was untouchable, that his badge gave him the right to act however he wanted. But now, in the span of a few short minutes, everything had crumbled around him. The other agents were moving in, surrounding him. He could hear them speaking, though their voices sounded distant, muffled like they were coming from underwater. One of the agents reached for his hand, pulling his arm behind his back. Ryan didn't resist. He couldn't. His mind was too numb, overloaded with the weight of his mistakes. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists, and for the first time, Ryan Steele felt what it was like to be on the other side of the law. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had cuffed hundreds of people during his career, but never had he imagined that one day it would be him standing there, helpless while the law closed in around him. As they led him toward the waiting car, Ryan glanced over his shoulder at Margaret. She was still standing where she had been the entire time, her expression unchanged. She watched him with that same calm, composed look, as if this were just another day at the office for her. And maybe it was. Before they shoved him into the back of the squad car, Margaret spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough that Ryan heard every word. "This isn't just about you, Officer Steele," she said. "This is about your entire department, your entire system. We're going to take it all down." Ryan's heart sank. He had thought the worst was over, that it couldn't possibly get any worse than this. But as the door slammed shut behind him and the agents moved to debrief Margaret, he realized that the nightmare had only just begun. The sirens faded into the distance as the car pulled away, leaving Margaret standing alone on the quiet street, the sound of the city slowly returning to normal around her. But nothing about this moment was normal. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would ripple far beyond this one encounter. And for Ryan Steele, it was the end of everything he had ever known. Ryan Steele sat in the back of the squad car, the cuffs biting into his wrists, his mind a storm of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The interior of the car was stifling, the air heavy with the scent of old leather and sweat. His thoughts were even more suffocating. He couldn't stop replaying the events of the past hour in his head, the confrontation, the punch, the badge, the revelation that Margaret Hill wasn't just some random woman, but an undercover FBI agent. The reality of what he had done hit him over and over again, each time with more weight. He had assaulted a federal agent, assaulted her on camera. His career, his life, everything he thought was unshakable was unraveling before his eyes. He had spent years building up an image of himself as a tough, no-nonsense cop. He had learned to wield his authority with an iron fist, believing that the badge gave him the right to control, to dominate, to impose order as he saw fit. But now, all of that was crumbling. And for the first time, Ryan didn't know what to do, The squad car jolted as it hit a pothole, shaking Ryan from his thoughts. He glanced out the window, his heart sinking as they drove past familiar streets. The city rushed by in a blur of lights and shadows. These streets had always been his domain, places where he felt like he had control. But now they seemed foreign, distant, as if he were seeing them from the wrong side of the law. And that's exactly where he was now, on the wrong side. His stomach churned as he thought about what awaited him. He had seen what happened to officers who crossed the line, who got caught in scandals. Some were lucky enough to get away with a slap on the wrist, but others lost everything. And this wasn't just some minor scandal. He hadn't bent the rules or skimmed off the top. He had hit an FBI agent, on camera. The thought made his stomach turn. How did it get this far? The car came to a slow stop outside the precinct, the flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the walls of the building, casting an eerie glow across the lot. Ryan's pulse quickened. This wasn't how he was supposed to be coming back to the station. He had entered this building hundreds, maybe thousands of times with his head held high, walking in as one of the enforcers of the law. But now, the roles were reversed. He wasn't walking in as an officer anymore. He was walking in as a criminal. The rear door of the squad car swung open, and one of the officers, a younger guy, not someone Ryan recognized, motioned for him to step out. Ryan hesitated for a second, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him, making it hard to move. But the officer's grip on his arm was firm as he guided him out of the car. As soon as Ryan stood up, the reality of his situation hit him like a freight train. The handcuffs clinked against each other, the cold metal biting into his skin as he was led toward the entrance of the precinct. It was the same entrance he had walked through countless times, but this time felt different. Horrifyingly different. Every step felt heavier than the last. As they approached the front desk, heads turned and officers and staff in the precinct noticed who was being brought in. Murmurs spread through the room like wildfire, hushed voices whispering Ryan's name, questioning what they were seeing. He could feel their eyes on him. Officers he had worked with for years. Officers he had shared drinks with, laughed with. Officers who had once looked up to him. "What the hell is going on?" someone muttered, their voice filled with confusion and disbelief. "Him? In cuffs?" another voice whispered, barely audible over the hum of conversation. The younger officer guiding him didn't say a word as they walked through the front area, past the gawking officers and toward the holding area. As the door swung open, Ryan took one last look around, trying to hold on to whatever fragments of his old life remained. But it was no use. Every step took him further from the man he used to be and closer to the consequences he could no longer escape. Ryan's legs felt like lead, each step an agonizing reminder of what was happening. He kept his head down, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. He didn't need to look to know what they were thinking. They were all thinking the same thing. How did this happen? As they reached the processing desk, Ryan was shoved into a chair in front of a thick glass partition. The officer who had been guiding him stepped aside, replaced by a processing officer, a man who, by the looks of it, was used to dealing with hardened criminals, not fellow cops. He sat across from Ryan, clipboard in hand, and stared at him for a moment, as if trying to process what he was seeing. "Name?" the officer finally asked, his voice flat, professional, as if this were just another routine booking. Ryan swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Ryan Steele," he muttered, barely able to get the words out. The officer scribbled something on his clipboard. "You know the drill, Steele. Charges are pending, but assaulting a federal agent is the big one." Ryan's throat tightened. He wanted to protest, to explain himself, but what could he say? There was no explaining away what had happened. He had done exactly what the officer had said, and now he had to deal with the consequences. "You're going to be held in the cells until they figure out what to do with you," the processing officer continued, barely looking up from his clipboard. "You'll probably be transferred to federal custody pretty soon, but for now, you're our guest." Ryan felt a sick sense of irony at the word guest. He wasn't a guest. He was a prisoner, and that fact was becoming more and more real with every passing second. After being fingerprinted and photographed, Ryan was led down a narrow hallway to the holding cells. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, stale cigarettes, and the faint hint of disinfectant. He had been down this hallway many times before, escorting suspects, but now it felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him with every step. The officer guiding him unlocked a cell door, the loud metallic clang reverberating off the walls, making Ryan flinch. The door swung open and he was unceremoniously shoved inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that sent a wave of dread crashing over him. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed in his ears, and for the first time in his life, Ryan Steele was locked in a cell. He stood there for a moment, the reality of his situation sinking in. The cell was small, barely large enough for the narrow cot pushed up against the far wall, and the tiny metal sink in the corner. There was a toilet exposed with no privacy, and the walls were dingy, covered in graffiti scratched into the paint. This was it. This was his new reality. Ryan sat down heavily on the cot, his head in his hands, the cold steel of the handcuffs still biting into his wrists. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of this, trying to come up with some plan, some excuse, something that could save him. But there was nothing. He had made his choices, and now there was no escaping the consequences. The hours dragged on, the silence in the cell broken only by the occasional sounds of officers moving through the hallway, or the distant murmur of voices. Ryan's thoughts spiraled, bouncing between anger and fear, disbelief and regret. He wanted to blame someone, Margaret, the FBI, anyone but himself, but deep down, he knew the truth. This was his fault. He had let his temper get the best of him, and now he was paying the price. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of footsteps approached his cell. Ryan looked up to see a familiar face. Lieutenant Greg Hannon, his direct superior. Hannon stood outside the bars, his face grim, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at Ryan with a mixture of disappointment and something else. Something Ryan couldn't quite place. What the hell happened, Steele? Hanan finally asked, his voice low but filled with anger. What did you do? Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could he explain it? How could he make Hanan understand what had led to this? How could he explain how everything had spiraled out of control so quickly? I didn't, Ryan started, but the words felt hollow, empty. He had no defense. It just happened, Lieutenant. I didn't know. Hanan's eyes narrowed. Didn't know what? That she was FBI? Or didn't know that you were crossing the line again? Ryan felt his stomach churn, the weight of Hanan's words hanging in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Ryan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Hanan shook his head, his expression hardening. That doesn't matter anymore, Steele. What matters is what you did, and you're going to have to face the consequences for it. Ryan felt the last shreds of hope slipping away. Hanan was right. There was no getting out of this. No excuses, no explanations would change what had happened. I'm sorry, Ryan whispered, though the words felt meaningless, even to him. Hanan stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then without another word he turned and walked away, leaving Ryan alone in the cell with nothing but his guilt and regret to keep him company. The sound of the cell block door closing behind Hanan echoed through the hallway, and Ryan sank back onto the cot, his head in his hands. Meanwhile, Margaret Hill sat across from the rest of her team in a windowless temporary setup deep within the heart of the city. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead cast a sterile glow over the cramped space. This wasn't a typical FBI office. The walls were lined with corkboards, each filled with photos, documents, and maps detailing months of investigative work. Files lay scattered across the long table in the center of the room, their contents spilling out in disorganized piles as agents flipped through them. Margaret remained focused, her expression calm but her eyes intense. She knew that what had happened today was just the beginning. There was still so much more work to be done, and they were far from finished. Margaret leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the evening's events pressing down on her. It wasn't the physical pain from Ryan Steele's punch, though her cheek was still tender and bruised. It was the emotional toll of the mission finally coming to a head. After weeks of undercover work, after so many long, frustrating days of collecting evidence, confronting Steele had been both a victory and a deeply sobering experience. Across the table, Special Agent in Charge Daniel Harris, her supervisor, was rifling through the latest reports. He was a tall man with a stern face and sharp eyes, always calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead. Harris had been in the Bureau for decades, and his experience showed in every decision he made. He was steady, a rock, the kind of leader who inspired confidence in his team, even in the most difficult situations. He glanced up at Margaret, his expression unreadable, though she could sense the concern in his eyes. "You all right, Hill?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Margaret nodded, though the dull ache in her cheek reminded her of what had transpired. "I'm fine. Nothing I haven't dealt with before." Harris studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "That was a hell of a punch Steele threw. You handled it well." "I had to," Margaret replied, her voice calm but weary. "If I hadn't, we wouldn't have gotten what we needed." The room fell silent for a moment, the gravity of her words hanging in the air. The tension between Margaret and Officer Steele had been real, raw even, but it had been necessary. She had known that Steele was a ticking time bomb, and all it had taken was the right nudge to push him over the edge. "You were right about him from the start," Harris said, tapping a pen against the edge of the table. "We knew there were problems in that department, but Steele, he's worse than we thought." Margaret sighed, the weight of the entire investigation pressing down on her shoulders. She had been embedded in Steele's precinct for weeks, working under the guise of a retired elderly woman who had moved into the neighborhood. She had spent countless hours quietly observing, noting the interactions between officers and the community, the way people of color were treated differently from white residents, the way officers like Steele abused their authority in subtle and not so subtle ways. "I saw it early on," Margaret said, her voice steady but filled with quiet frustration. Steele wasn't just an officer following orders. He was actively looking for reasons to use force, to assert his power. He took pleasure in it. The rest of the team, 4 other agents who had been working alongside her in various capacities, nodded in agreement. Each of them had seen the signs. Officers like Steele, officers who had become so entrenched in their roles that they believed they were untouchable. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about a culture that had been allowed to fester for years, unchecked by those in charge. "We've got everything we need now," Harris said, his voice cutting through the silence. "The footage from your body cam, the audio, the testimonies you've gathered, it's more than enough to make this case." Steele's actions tonight sealed his fate. Margaret nodded, though her mind was already moving past Steele. He was just one piece of the puzzle. His actions had been egregious, but they were symptomatic of a larger problem. There were other officers in that precinct who had enabled Steele, who had turned a blind eye to his behavior or worse, encouraged it. "It's not just Steele," Margaret said, her tone hardening. "There's more going on in that department. The corruption runs deep, and I'm not sure we've uncovered all of it yet." Harris nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "We've got eyes on several other officers. Steele might be the most obvious, but we know he wasn't acting alone. This goes higher up. Lieutenant Hanan's been on our radar for a while now. His fingerprints are all over this." Margaret felt a surge of anger at the mention of Hanan. She had watched him closely during her time undercover. He was careful, much more so than Steele, but his complicity was unmistakable. He had fostered an environment where officers like Steele could thrive, where the abuse of power was not only tolerated but encouraged. "Hanan's been covering for Steele for years," Margaret said, her voice edged with frustration. "Every complaint against Steele was either buried or dismissed. I'm sure Hanan's been taking kickbacks too, though we haven't been able to prove it yet." Harris tapped the pen against the table again, his mind clearly working through the logistics of the next steps. "We'll need to be strategic. We can't tip our hand too early or we risk spooking Hanan and the others. But now that we've got Steele in custody, the pressure's on. They know we're coming for them." Margaret glanced at the files spread across the table. Each one represented a case of police misconduct, people whose lives had been affected by officers like Steele, by a system that had failed to protect them. Each file told a story of injustice, of people who had been treated like criminals simply because of the color of their skin or the neighborhood they lived in, and each one weighed heavily on her conscience. "We have to do this right," she said, her voice quieter now but no less determined. "We have to make sure that when we take them down, they can't come back. No more slaps on the wrist, no more deals." Harris gave her a steady look. "That's the plan, but it's going to take time. We've got Steele now, and we'll flip him. Once he realizes what's on the line, he'll give us what we need to take down Hanan and the others." Margaret wasn't so sure. She had seen Steele's type before, men who believed they were invincible, who would cling to their power even as it slipped away from them. Flipping him wouldn't be easy, and she doubted he'd give up his colleagues without a fight. But Harris was right about one thing. They had the upper hand now. Steele was in custody, and with the evidence they had gathered, there was no way he could wriggle out of it. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. They just had to play their cards carefully. As the team continued to discuss the next steps, Margaret's thoughts drifted back to the confrontation with Steele. She had known it would be tense, but she hadn't expected him to snap so violently. It was a reminder of just how dangerous men like him could be when their power was threatened. She absently rubbed her cheek, the bruise still tender beneath her fingers. She had taken the punch and remained standing, but it wasn't the physical blow that lingered in her mind. It was the realization of how deep Steele's hatred went, how easily he had resorted to violence when faced with someone who refused to bend to his authority. "Margaret." Harris's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see him watching her with a concerned expression. "You okay?" he asked again, softer this time. Margaret nodded. though she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. "Just thinking about how much work we still have to do." Harris gave her a small nod, understanding. "We'll get them," he said. "It's going to take time, but we'll get them all." Margaret wanted to believe him. She had to believe him. For the sake of the people who had been hurt, for the families who had been torn apart by the abuses of officers like Steele and the corrupt system that protected them. She had to believe they would win this fight. But deep down, she knew that even when Steele and Hannan were brought down, the battle would continue. There would always be more officers like them, more departments like this one, and the fight for true justice was far from over. As the meeting wrapped up, Margaret gathered her things, slipping the files into her bag. As the rest of the team dispersed, she lingered for a moment, staring at the board filled with faces, victims, officers, witnesses. Each one was part of the larger story, the story of a system that had been allowed to rot from the inside. She took a deep breath and turned to leave, her mind already focused on the next phase of the operation. Steele was in custody, but the real work was just beginning. Ryan Steele sat alone in his small, bare cell, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall. The rhythmic hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly dim light over the stark room. There was no window, no clock, no sense of time in the cell, just the endless tick of his thoughts, growing louder with each passing second. The air smelled faintly of bleach and sweat, the scent clinging to the fabric of his uniform, now rumpled and stained. He could still feel the pressure of the handcuffs around his wrists, even though they had been removed hours ago. His mind was a chaotic blur, cycling through anger, fear, and disbelief. He kept replaying the moment he hit Margaret Hill, the split second when his fist had collided with her face, the sickening crunch of the impact. He had convinced himself that he was in control, that he had the power in that situation. But in truth, everything had spiraled out of control the moment he laid hands on her. How did I let it go this far? The thought gnawed at him, unrelenting. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, a line that marked the end of his career, his reputation, his life as he knew it. He had assaulted a federal agent, Margaret Hill, an FBI agent, someone who had been watching him, someone who had set him up. She had played him perfectly, pulling him deeper and deeper into her trap until he snapped. And now, he was sitting in a jail cell, waiting for his fate to be decided by people he had once called colleagues, people who only a few hours ago would have stood by him without question. Now they were the ones who had locked him up. The door to the holding area creaked open, and the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Ryan's head snapped up, his heart thudding in his chest. He expected to see a familiar face, maybe Lieutenant Hannan coming to offer some kind of assurance, or one of the officers from his precinct. But when the figure came into view, it wasn't anyone from the local police. It was Margaret Hill. She stood at the door to his cell, flanked by 2 federal agents in dark suits. Her face was bruised, a dark purple mark blooming across her cheek where his fist had landed. She stood tall, her posture unyielding, and there was no emotion in her eyes. No anger, no pity, just cold, professional resolve. Ryan's mouth went dry. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? He had hit her, he had attacked her, and now she stood on the other side of the bars, holding his future in her hands. One of the agents stepped forward and unlocked the cell door, the metallic click of the lock echoing loudly in the small space. Ryan watched as the door swung open, his heart pounding in his chest. The 2 agents remained outside the door, their expressions unreadable, waiting. Margaret took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. She crossed the threshold of the cell slowly, deliberately, her gaze locked onto his with an intensity that made Ryan's skin crawl. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, even as she stood mere inches from the man who had assaulted her. For a long moment, the 2 of them just stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Ryan could feel his pulse in his ears, his heart thudding wildly against his ribs. He tried to keep his face impassive, tried to project the confidence he once wore like armor, but it was slipping away. He could feel it like sand through his fingers. "You look like hell," Margaret said finally, her voice quiet but sharp. Ryan blinked, taken aback by her words. It wasn't the tone he had expected. There was no rage, no shouting. Just that same calm, controlled demeanor she had displayed from the start. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His voice cracked and he had to clear his throat before he could speak again. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her gaze hard and unwavering. "No," she said, her voice dripping with quiet skepticism. "You didn't mean to hit me? You didn't mean to lose control and assault a federal agent?" Ryan opened his mouth, but the words died before they even formed. He had no defense. He couldn't lie, not to her. She had seen everything, had provoked him, yes, but she hadn't made him throw that punch. That was all him. "I didn't know who you were," he muttered, his voice low, almost pleading. "I didn't know you were FBI. I thought you were just what?" Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuses like a knife. "Just an old woman you could push around? Someone you thought didn't matter?" Ryan's jaw clenched. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze any longer. She was right, of course. He had assumed that Margaret was just another nobody, another person in the wrong place at the wrong time. He hadn't cared who she was, only that she had challenged him, defied his authority. "Do you even know how many complaints have been filed against you?" Margaret asked, her voice suddenly sharp, filled with the weight of her anger. "How many times you've crossed the line and gotten away with it?" Ryan felt a chill run down his spine, but he said nothing. He couldn't deny the truth any longer. Margaret Hill stood before him, unbroken, and in that moment, he knew that everything he had built on his lies and power was about to come crashing down. Ryan didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew exactly how many complaints had been made against him. He had seen them, read the reports, watched them disappear into the abyss of the precinct's internal review process. None of it mattered. He had always known that as long as the people in charge had his back, he would be untouchable. Until now. Margaret took another step closer, her face just inches from his. "You think you're special, don't you?" she asked, her voice cold, hard. "You think you're different from all the other corrupt cops who get caught? That you're somehow above the law?" Ryan felt the heat rising in his chest, the familiar rush of anger bubbling up. He'd spent his entire career being told he was special, that he was the kind of cop the city needed. Tough, unyielding, willing to do what others wouldn't. But now, standing in front of Margaret Hill, all of that felt hollow. "I was doing my job," he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "I was keeping the streets safe." "People like you? People like me?" Margaret interrupted, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "You mean people who hold you accountable? People who don't fall in line when you decide to play God with their lives?" Ryan's fists clenched at his sides, muscles tensing. He had never felt so exposed, so powerless. Every word Margaret said cut deep, each one a reminder that his power, his control, was gone. "You think this is just about you?" Margaret's voice rose slightly. "You think you're the only one we're going after? You're part of a bigger problem, a system that's been rotting from the inside for years. You're just one piece of the puzzle." Ryan's mind raced. He had known the investigation was bigger than just him, but the way Margaret spoke, it sounded like something massive was coming. He wasn't just facing charges for assaulting her. This was bigger. It could destroy not just his career, but the entire department. What do you want from me?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling slightly. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but now it was mixed with fear. Margaret studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she took a step back, crossing her arms over her chest. "I want you to talk," she said simply. "Tell me everything you know about Hanlon. About the other officers involved. I want names, dates, details. Ryan's stomach twisted. Hanlon, his mentor, his superior, the man who had always had his back, the man who had protected him when complaints came in, the man who taught him how to navigate the murky waters of law enforcement. Turning on Hanlon would be like cutting off his own arm. I can't, Ryan whispered, shaking his head. I can't do that. Margaret's eyes hardened. You don't have a choice, Steele. You're facing federal charges, assaulting an FBI agent. That's not going away with a slap on the wrist. You're looking at serious prison time. You're done. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He was finished. His career was over. There was no way out. But the thought of turning on Hanlon, of betraying the man who had been like a father to him, was unbearable. If you cooperate, Margaret continued, her voice softening just slightly, we can work something out. But if you stay silent, you'll go down alone. And when you're sitting in a federal prison, you'll realize just how little loyalty means in the end. Ryan's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had spent years building his career, his reputation, and now, in the span of a few short hours, it had all come crashing down. Margaret was offering him a lifeline, but it came at a cost he wasn't sure he could pay. I need time, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's expression remained cold, unyielding. You don't have much time, Steele. The walls are closing in. You can either help us take down the rest of the corruption in your department, or you can go down with them. The choice is yours. With that, she turned and walked toward the cell door, leaving Ryan alone in the suffocating silence of his cell. The door clanged shut behind her, and the sound echoed in his ears long after she was gone. The news of Officer Ryan Steele's arrest spread like wildfire. It was all over the media. Local stations, newspapers, even national outlets picked up the story. Headlines screamed about the rogue cop who had assaulted an undercover FBI agent. The narrative quickly evolved, with journalists digging into Steele's past, his numerous complaints of misconduct, and his connection to a wider web of corruption within the police department. Public outrage was immediate. The community, already on edge from years of tension between law enforcement and residents, erupted into protests outside the police precinct. People gathered in droves, holding signs that read, "Justice for all and end police brutality." The atmosphere was charged with anger, frustration, and a simmering sense that this moment was about more than just Ryan Steele. It was about an entire system that had failed to hold people like him accountable for far too long. Margaret Hill stood in front of a bank of televisions in the temporary FBI office, watching the news coverage unfold. Her bruised face, though healing, was still a painful reminder of the night she had confronted Steele. She had taken a personal risk by going undercover in such a dangerous, racially charged environment, but it had been worth it. The evidence they had gathered, audio recordings, video footage, testimony from victims, was damning. Steele was just the tip of the iceberg. Now that they had him, the rest of the corrupt officers would soon follow. Harris, her supervisor, walked up beside her, crossing his arms as he stared at the screens. "It's bigger than we thought," he said quietly. "These protests, they're about more than Steele. They're about the entire department." Margaret nodded. They've been waiting for this. The community's been living under the thumb of officers like Steele for years. He's not the only one. This is a chance for them to finally be heard, Margaret said, her voice resolute. Harris glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You think it's going to get worse?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said firmly. "Once we start pulling at this thread, it's going to unravel the whole department. People will push back, both inside and outside the precinct." Harris sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly under the weight of what was coming. "We're prepared for that," he said, though his tone was weary. "But it's going to be a fight. We'll need Steele to flip. He's our best shot at bringing down the higher-ups." Margaret's gaze remained locked on the screens. "He'll flip," she said, her voice steady, her voice, He knows what's coming and he knows he can't face it alone. He'll talk. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy. Steele was loyal to the system that had protected him for years. Loyal to Hanlon, his superior, who had shielded him from the consequences of his actions time and again. Breaking that loyalty would take more than just the threat of prison time. It would take a reckoning, a confrontation with who he was and what he had become. As the news continued to unfold on the screens, Margaret's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from one of the agents stationed at the precinct. "Hanlon's watching you. Be careful." Margaret's eyes narrowed. She had expected this. Hanlon was smart, cunning even. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know how to cover his tracks. But now, with Steele in custody and the investigation closing in, he would be desperate. Desperate men made dangerous choices. Inside the precinct, Lieutenant Greg Hanlon stood in his office, staring at the closed blinds that separated him from the growing chaos outside. The muffled sounds of the protest drifted in, chants, the occasional shout, car horns, and the distant hum of helicopters circling overhead. He could feel the pressure mounting, the walls closing in. For years he had managed to keep things under control, running the department his way. Officers like Steele had been free to do their jobs without interference from bureaucrats and watchdogs. Hanlon had silenced complaints, smoothed over internal investigations, and ensured his boys stayed on the streets, doing the hard, necessary work of keeping the city safe. But now everything was falling apart. Steele had been reckless, stupid. Hanlon had warned him about losing his temper, about letting his aggression get the best of him. But Steele hadn't listened, and now he had punched an undercover FBI agent. Even now, days after the incident, Hanlon could hardly believe it. The punch had been caught on camera. There was no hiding it, no smoothing it over. Steele had gone too far, and now the entire department was under the microscope. The phone on Hanlon's desk buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the caller ID, one of his contacts at City Hall. After a brief hesitation, he picked up. "Hanlon," he said curtly. "Lieutenant, we've got a problem," came the voice on the other end. It was thin, anxious. More anxious than Hanlon had ever heard it before. "The mayor's office is talking about a full internal review of the precinct. They're bringing in outside investigators, civilian oversight committees. It's going to be a complete overhaul if you don't get this under control." Hanlon's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles whitening as the reality sank in. A full internal review meant everything would come out. The cover-ups, the corruption, the backroom deals. If the public got their hands on that information, it wouldn't just be Steele going down. It would be him. The entire command structure would be gutted, leaving nothing but scandal and disgrace in its wake. "We're working on it," Hanlon replied, his voice cold and measured, though his heart raced. "Steele's been arrested. He's the face of this right now. We're distancing the rest of the department from him. He'll take the fall." "It's not going to be enough," the voice insisted, urgency rising. "This is bigger than Steele. The protests, the media, they want blood. They want accountability, and they're going to dig until they find it. You need to get ahead of this or they'll bury you." Hanlon was silent for a moment, his mind spinning. He had been in tough situations before, but nothing like this. The public was demanding answers, and if they found out the full extent of what had been going on in his precinct, there would be no stopping the fallout. "Let me handle Steele," Hanlon said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "He won't talk." "And if he does?" the voice on the phone asked, fear creeping in. Hanlon's eyes darkened. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't." Back at the FBI office, Margaret was sitting at her desk, reviewing the files they had collected on Steele and the other officers under investigation. She had spent hours combing through the details. Complaints from civilians, reports of misconduct swept under the rug. Evidence of a coordinated effort to protect officers like Steele from the consequences of their actions. It was a tangled web, and at the center of it was Hanlon. She had been watching him closely ever since she went undercover. Hanlon had been careful, very careful. But even he couldn't cover everything. There were signs of his involvement, subtle but unmistakable. A few conversations caught on tape, a pattern of dismissing complaints that implicated his favorite officers, including Steele. Margaret knew that if they could get Steele to flip, they could bring Hanlon down with him. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Harris. "Margaret," Harris said as soon as she picked up, his voice tense. "We've got a problem. Steele's not talking." Margaret frowned, her heart sinking slightly. "He's refusing to cooperate?" "Not exactly," Harris replied. "He's scared. Hanlon's got a grip on him. Steele knows if he talks, it's over for him. Hanlon will take him out." Margaret's blood ran cold. She had anticipated that Hanlon might try to protect himself but outright threatening Steele's life. That was a dangerous escalation. "We need to get to Steele before Hanlon does," she said, standing from her desk. "If Hanlon's that desperate, he might try something drastic." "We're moving him to a secure federal facility tomorrow morning," Harris said, "but tonight he's still in city lockup." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. City lockup was still within Hanlon's reach. She had seen it before, how the most powerful figures in law enforcement could make people disappear, even from within the precinct. "I'll go to the lockup," Margaret said, already grabbing her jacket. "I'll make sure he's safe until the transfer. If Hanlon tries something, I'll be there." Harris hesitated for a moment before sighing. "Be careful, Hill. Hanlon's a dangerous man when he's backed into a corner." "I know," Margaret replied, her voice steady but tense. "That's why I have to do this." Later that night, Margaret arrived at the city lockup. The tension in the air was palpable. The precinct was quieter than usual. The protests outside had dispersed, leaving a heavy calm inside. Officers moved through the halls with their heads down, fully aware that their entire department was under scrutiny and that any wrong move could bring even more unwanted attention. Margaret made her way down to the holding area, where Steele was being kept until his transfer in the morning. The guard on duty gave her a wary look but said nothing. Everyone knew who she was now, the undercover agent who had brought down one of their own. Steele was sitting in his cell, his back against the wall, staring blankly at the floor. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot as if he hadn't slept in days. He looked up as Margaret approached, his expression unreadable. "You're still here?" Margaret said, stepping up to the bars. "I wasn't sure if you'd make it through the night." Margaret clenched her jaw, her mind spinning as she tried to think through the haze of frustration and grief. "Not yet," she said, pacing the small cell, her eyes still locked on Steele's lifeless body. "But this, it's too clean, too fast. Hanlon must have had someone on the inside. There's no way Steele dies hours before his transfer without help." Harris was silent on the other end for a moment, and Margaret could hear him exhaling slowly, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady. "First, we lock this place down. I'll get a team over there to collect evidence. We can't let anyone else leave the precinct until we've combed through it." Margaret nodded, though Harris couldn't see her. "I'll start now," she said. "There has to be something, a camera, a loose thread, anything that ties this back to Hanlon." She pocketed her phone and turned on her heel, determination hardening her steps. As she made her way back through the precinct, the stillness she had felt earlier now seemed suffocating, as if the entire building was holding its breath. She knew that whatever had happened to Steele wasn't just an isolated event. This was a sign that Hanlon wasn't done yet, that he had the reach, the power, and the ruthlessness to silence anyone who stood in his way. When Margaret reached the security office, she found it empty. A single monitor flickered on the desk, showing various angles of the holding area. Her heart raced as she scrolled through the footage, looking for any clue of what had happened in the hours since she had last seen Steele alive. The cameras had been wiped. Of course. Margaret cursed under her breath, slamming her fist down on the desk. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment hit. This was planned, executed with precision. Suddenly, the door creaked open behind her. Margaret spun around, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun, but she stopped when she saw who it was. Harris stood in the doorway, his face pale, tension in every line of his body. "Anything?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing," Margaret said, her frustration barely contained. They wiped the footage. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. No struggle, no signs of forced entry, just gone. Harris ran a hand through his hair, his eyes dark with concern. "So we're back to square one." "Not quite." Margaret's voice was steel. "Hanlon did this. We just need to prove it." Harris nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we go all in. We put the pressure on, bring in every resource we have. He thinks he can get away with this, but we're going to make sure he doesn't." Margaret felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't over. Steele's death had escalated things, but it also meant they were getting close. Too close for Hanlon's comfort. They just had to find the right crack in his armor and keep pushing. "Let's start with Steele's cell," she said, turning to leave the security office. "There's bound to be something. Even if it's small, we'll find it." As they headed back down the dimly lit hallway toward the holding area, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Steele was dead, but the conspiracy was far from buried. Hanlon had underestimated how far they were willing to go to bring him down. Now it was a fight to the end. Margaret moved with purpose, her heart pounding in sync with the rapid steps of the FBI agents fanning out across the precinct. She could feel the tension in the air as officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what was coming but sensing the storm that had arrived. Harris was right beside her. His jaw clenched as they marched down the hallway toward Hanlon's office. The whispers grew louder, but no one dared stop them. Margaret's gaze was fixed ahead, laser-focused on the door at the end of the hall, the door that, in moments, would lead to the takedown of the man responsible for Steele's death and the rot that had infected the entire department. They reached Hanlon's office. Margaret exchanged a quick look with Harris, her hand hovering just above the handle. This was it, the culmination of months of investigation, the countless sleepless nights, the risks, the sacrifices. All of it came down to this moment. Harris gave her a nod. Margaret steeled herself, then knocked firmly on the door. "Lieutenant Hanlon, FBI, open the door." Silence. Margaret's pulse quickened. She could feel the other agents closing in around them, ready to move at her signal. Another knock, louder this time. "Hanlon, open the door now." Still nothing. Without hesitation, Margaret reached for the door handle and turned it. Locked. She stepped back and nodded at the agent beside her, who swiftly moved forward with a battering ram. With one solid hit, the door flew open and the team surged inside. The room was dimly lit, the blinds drawn, and the air was thick with tension. Papers were scattered across the desk, as if someone had been rifling through them in a hurry. But Hanlon wasn't at his desk. He wasn't even in the room. Margaret's heart sank. She took a step forward, scanning the office. It was messy, disorganized, nothing like the crisp, meticulous lieutenant she had come to know over the months of surveillance. "Harris," she muttered under her breath, her eyes narrowing. "He knew we were coming." Harris cursed under his breath. "We've been compromised." Margaret turned on her heel, heading for the door. "We need to find him now." As the team began tearing through the office, collecting evidence, Margaret's mind raced. Hanlon had slipped through their fingers, but he couldn't have gone far. Not yet. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she snatched it out, already fearing the worst. It was a message from one of the surveillance teams stationed outside. Hanlon just left through the back. Black SUV, tinted windows, heading west. Margaret's blood boiled. He was running. She sprinted out of the office, barking orders to the team as she ran. "Harris, get a trace on that vehicle. We can't let him slip away." The precinct was alive with chaos now. Officers and agents moving in every direction, trying to figure out what was happening. Margaret pushed through the crowd, her mind focused on one thing: catching Hanlon before he disappeared for good. She burst through the front doors, the early morning light blinding her momentarily. The air was cool and sharp, but she barely felt it as she spotted Harris pulling up in an unmarked SUV. Margaret jumped into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut behind her. "They've got eyes on him," Harris said, already flooring the gas pedal. "He's heading for the interstate." Margaret's heart raced as the city blurred past them. She knew Hanlon was desperate now. He had ordered Steele's death, and now that the heat was on him, he was trying to escape the collapse of his empire. But Margaret wasn't about to let him get away. The chase was on. "We're not losing him," Margaret growled, her eyes locked on the road ahead. "Not this time." As they sped through the city streets, sirens blaring in the distance, Margaret knew one thing for certain. Today, no matter what, Hanlon was going down. Margaret sat back, letting out a long breath as the weight of the day began to settle in. The scene that had unfolded at the precinct replayed in her mind. The tense arrest, Hanlon's defiance, and the flicker of fear she had glimpsed in his eyes. It was a victory, but the bittersweet kind. Hanlon was in custody, the corruption was laid bare, and they had what they needed to dismantle the network he had built. But the scars from the fight were still fresh. Steele's death weighed heavily on her, a life cut short in the middle of the war for justice. He had been part of the system, part of the problem, but he had also been ready to help, ready to redeem himself. His loss wasn't just another casualty in the war against corruption. It was a reminder of the human cost, of the real lives affected by the tangled web of lies and deceit. Harris had been right earlier, standing beside her as they watched the crowd outside the precinct. Corruption was like a weed, deeply rooted and persistent. They had pulled one up today, but there would be others. She could feel it. Other officers, other systems that had been complicit enabling Hanlon's reign. This was a beginning, not an end. The notebook she'd found in Hanlon's desk was still tucked into her jacket, heavy with its implications. Dozens of names, a roadmap of the corruption that had poisoned the department. It would take time to go through it all, to follow each lead, to bring each guilty party to justice. But Margaret was ready. The fight wasn't over. It might never truly be, but they had made a difference today, and that was enough for now. As Margaret stared out at the darkening skyline, the distant hum of the city her only company, she allowed herself a moment of quiet. Her phone buzzed with Harris's message. "We made a difference today. Get some rest." Margaret smiled faintly, her mind finally beginning to slow. The day had been long and grueling, but she had done it. They had done it. The first step in cleaning up the corruption, in restoring some semblance of justice, had been taken. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. The system they were fighting was vast, and those they were up against would do everything they could to protect themselves. But tonight, Margaret allowed herself to feel the peace she had earned. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes as the weight of exhaustion began to settle in. Tomorrow the work would continue, but for tonight, she would rest. She had earned it.